You're listening to the Real Estate Runway podcast, powered by Quattro Capital, where we are all about alternative business and investment strategies to help you amplify life and maximize wealth. Here's your host, the recovering engineer turned multifamily investor, Chad Sutton.
All right, Real Estate Runway family. This is another episode of the Real Estate Runway podcast. I'm joined today with Rob Beardsley of Lone Star Capital. Rob oversees the acquisitions and capital markets for Lone Star Capital and has acquired over $100 million of multifamily real estate in his career. He has evaluated thousands of opportunities using proprietary underwriting models and published the #1 book on underwriting for multifamily properties, The Definitive Guide to Underwriting Multifamily Acquisitions. Rob, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, Rob, tell me a little bit about yourself. I don't think you were born, as a multifamily underwriting expert. So, how did you come to discover the industry, and what led you down the path of discovering that this is really the value you bring to this industry and building your business around that?
So, my background, I grew up in Silicon Valley, California, which is all about tech, startups, and that kind of stuff. So, there was a strong influence in that arena. But at the same time, I grew up in a real estate family. My parents ran a residential brokerage firm, and they did construction development, but all on the single family side of things. So they were looking at their businesses and thought, well, this real estate thing really isn't that exciting. It's just a lot of hard work. And you look at the tech stuff, our neighbor there down the street, they just sold a company for X millions and they're doing so wonderful. And this is what you should do. So I, both grew up around that influence, but also had a analytical number background, if you will. So I went to school for computer science, always loved math. And so preferred to focus on those types of things rather than writing a book, for example, which, funny enough, coming for full circle, that was something that I really enjoyed doing as well. So, but with that being in mind, I, felt that there had to be some way out there to, generate wealth and then multiply it and grow it over time, which, real estate should be able to offer, but my family's business wasn't quite doing that just because we were focused on the transaction side of things. So that paradigm shift was really one of the big moments in my life and to help my family transition as well as we've all kind of come together into this new space. My family now is nearly 100% focused on multifamily, while I have, gone off and met my business partner and started Lone Star Capital, which is my day-to-day focus. So yeah, really that transition, that paradigm shift of trying to, build assets and create passive income, even though no one was ready to retire yet, but just having that mindset, you can never be too early to that mindset.
Yeah, it's really, if you can build that from the ground up, not only are you building for control in business, you're building with controls, but then when you build those controls around cash flow and not transactions, you actually have the opportunity to free yourself at one point, right? The music doesn't stop when you stop, so very good. Well, you have positioned yourself as an underwriting expert in this industry, and I think you've worked with a few large groups we would all know about as well. So first question, are you doing deals primarily as Lone Star Capital, or are you working with other groups to acquire the properties that you are taking down?
So at this time, my focus is pretty much all on Lone Star. We're building out our acquisitions process. We're bringing people onto the team to help us with asset management. Most excitingly right now, we're going through the process of vertically integrating. So we've launched our in-house property management company, having to go through all the learning curves associated with actually building a management company, which is very operationally intensive, people heavy. All multifamily is just a people business, all the way down from the leasing agent all the way up to raising capital, right? It's all people all along the way. So we're really excited about this new phase, and we think it's going to really help amplify our growth. So we're just looking to keep the pipeline steady, add more properties to the portfolio, which will now not only feed the the investment side of the business, but also the management side.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And I don't think enough people understand that, building an acquisitions and asset management company is a completely different animal to those who are boots on the ground, running the asset, dealing with maintenance requests, tenants, things of that sort. So, that's got to be a tough thing to be doing at one time, but congratulations on starting that part of your business. So as far as the way you underwrite deals, let's get into some meat for a second. Most of our listeners are either LP investors in these types of acquisitions, so they need to understand how they need to be looking at deals and deciding where to invest. But also, we have a lot of young sponsors listening here, and even seasoned sponsors as well. So one thing that I have found personally that is lacking in this industry is a true and detailed understanding of the numbers, and not just the property, but of the deal structure and what that means, and how money flows. So I guess I would start with your process when you are looking at the property. We'll talk about structure and returns later, but when you're looking at the property, how does Rob Beardsley and Lone Star Capital decide that a particular acquisition is worthy of a purchase?
So we start with just our general criteria, which doesn't narrow things down a ton, but at least it gets us to focus a little bit. So in my opinion, it's advantageous to pick a market or two and go deep and become an expert in that market, right? Rather than looking at every single deal possible and hoping that you find the good one. By actually narrowing your focus and looking at less deals, you're more likely to get more deals. That's just my opinion. So that kind of starts from that level. Next, we generally have certain vintages that we're more interested in. A brand new deal is not a fit for us. So we just ignore deals that are built, let's say, newer than 2008 or something like that. And the older side is a bit trickier because we don't want to just completely discount any deal that was built in the 60s, because you just don't know exactly how it was built. What does the infrastructure look like and things like that. So that's a more nuanced approach. But so vintage, location, and then I would say incomes. If it's got 20K incomes in the immediate vicinity, we'll just most likely outright pass on it unless there's some interesting story with the numbers, or we can get comfortable with the data otherwise. So those are some few things that narrow it down for us. And then from there, we really just dive in head first on a preliminary underwriting. And so a lot of people ask me that, what's your shortcut, or what's your back of the napkin? And we don't have one. We don't tiptoe into a deal. If it's a yes, then we're going to go through our full underwriting process, which includes filling out our model, doing some rent comps, coming up with pro forma rents, and things like that. So that is our approach. And as it gets, if we can't throw away the deal immediately after that, doing a rough underwriting, then we just continue to refine the numbers as best as we can, right? Really, the things to refine are the pro forma rents, which are very sensitive to returns. So making sure those are nailed down. And then the CapEx budget, those are kind of some bigger things that aren't readily knowable that you need to do some legwork to figure out. And then, there's just so much more to go on, but that bleeds more into due diligence rather than just underwriting itself.
I love the way you said that. You're always, at least at Quattro Capital, we're always trying to kill the deal, right? We're starting out with as simple, and we actually have built a simple napkin underwriting is what we call it, but it doesn't tell you very much, right? That you can only really get so far, and it can kind of help you weed a few things out. But we've had to really make it model after the larger, the outputs have to be similar to the larger model, and we have some sensitivities to understand there. But you're right. Once you really get into it and figure out what the major inputs are that affect the model, and those are going to be income, right? Income and income realization is probably one of the most important things in the model, and then how much money you have to spend to get there. And how many times do you see when I don't know if you review other deals that other people bring you at this point or not, but at least from the broker's underwriting, when you probably start there, how often do you see that the CapEx presented does not agree with the income being realized?
Yeah, you see it all, and you see it all from the brokers, other sponsors. Everyone's got their own way to underwrite and make sense of the numbers, right? So it's hard to say one way is right or wrong. That's why one of the things I stress is consistency. You may have a certain way of underwriting, and that's perfectly fine. But as long as you do that consistently, meaning this way that you underwrite through the same model and same typical assumptions and whatnot, then it's fine, because it's going to help you pick out the deals that stand out from the crowd. Because that's at the end of the day what we're looking for. We want to invest in the top 5 or top 1% of deals that we are looking at. And at that point, it's a percentile thing, and we're less concerned with the actual number that the model's kicking out. So now that was a little bit of a tangent from that question, but that's one way that kind of, you can in a way protect yourself.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I, that's probably the biggest thing that we see as a hurdle in making sure your models tie out is the amount of money you're projecting to spend actually tying out with the rent that is going to be realized. Now, how do you approach I'm going to call it income realization. It's something that we look at, and the extreme of this that I'm talking about here is, I can't tell you how many deals I've reviewed from either brokers or other sponsors wanting to partner with us, where the rent that is pro forma is shown in year one. And let's say we're going from 800 to $1,000 on some sort of a renovation. And guess what? The gross potential rents in year one shows. It shows $1,000 times 12 months times the number of units. I'm like, no, because you have to, you start with a rent roll, and you have to generally mold that rent roll or gradually mold that rent roll to get to where you're going. So what is your approach? Everyone does this differently, by the way. I don't think there's a right answer as long as you account for it. But what is your approach to actually, showing how long it's going to take you to get that property stabilized, from point A to point B?
Yeah. And like you said, so underwriting models are almost all the same, right? At the end of the day, what are we doing? We're projecting out a stream of cash flows, and then we've got a terminal valuation, which just means the number that you're going to sell the deal for. And now that's your stream of cash flows, and that's your IRR. But the biggest way that models differ is really the stabilization period. Some people, they'll pull out a whole rent roll and they'll say, okay, this is how many units we're going to rent per month, and this is how long it's going to take for each one. And they can break it all down, and there's so many different ways to do it. So the way that we have chosen to approach this is by trying to keep it as simple as possible, and essentially determining how many number of months is needed to stabilize the asset or to take it from point A to point B. And once we determine how many months that is, let's say it's 18 months, then we'll just simply trend the in-place GPR to the pro forma GPR on a linear basis over those 18 months, right? In real life, things aren't linear, of course, but it's a good model approximation to just say, if you're going from 800 to 1,000, right, and you just take that $200 delta, divide it by 18, and then each month you'll just add on that little increment, and then you'll get to 1,000 eventually. So this is a very simple way for us to look at it. And what we think in our head is, okay, well, what occupancy do we want to maintain during this period, which means roughly how many units are going to be vacant at any given time. And then that gives us a more realistic idea of how many units we can actually renovate per month. And then that, of course, determines the stabilization timeline. So that's how we go.
I love that, and that's a really good mathematical approximation. For those of you on the listening side here who are not nerdy brains like Rob and I are, when we're talking about a linear approximation, envision point A and point B, and envision a straight and gradual line going between those two. So it is an approximation. In reality, it could stay low for a little while and then ramp up, or it could ramp up really high and then level off. You really don't know. But so in your experience, Rob, I mean, at this point, you have operated and dispositioned a number of assets. So you would be qualified to say, well, how good is that approximation? I mean, is it a pretty good agreement with how things go, or is it slightly conservative, usually exceeded? What do you see?
So really, again, as all things, it's really as good as you are the user. So if you have a 400 unit deal and you want to renovate every single unit, and you just use a 12-month stabilization timeline, you're going to linearly go, but it's that never would happen in real life. So that's why we always try to bake in maybe an extra 3 months or an extra 5 months in our stabilization period, just because we know things, especially everyone knows with construction, it's always over budget, delayed and whatnot. So having that extra time helps us be more accurate. And so from what we've seen, the way that we, the numbers that we're using, it's pretty, it's accurate, and it gives us some room to outperform.
Fantastic. Now, as far as, income is a real bear itself. So I think as long as you have a strategy and you follow that, and you understand how to use it, to your point, that can be, that can be solidified. Expenses, I kind of want to gloss over for a second. I don't know if there's anything special you do in the expense range. For me, it's just basic, accounting. What does the seller have? Verify taxes and insurance and property management, and pretty much everything else is what it is, unless I have a business reason to change it. Do you have any other nuggets or tidbits that you would throw out that you really need to be paying attention to in the expense category? Operating expense, that is.
Right. Yeah. So for the big one that you mentioned is taxes, and that requires a lot of homework and professional advice on. So, and depending on where you are, that could make up a major portion of your total expenses. So that's a big one. But there's not really that much you can do about it, or that much you can get creative about. On the expense side, though, there are ways to get creative to create more value and potentially find a way to be a competitive bidder, and that would be saving expenses by finding ways to run the property with a cheaper payroll or reducing utilities and things like that. There's not a ton that you can do, but that is where you can create some value that maybe the market generally is missing.
Fantastic. And so switching from that over to the renovation side, right? This is the other side that can really make or break you, because it in effect is the denominator in all returns calculations, right? It is the investment that must be made. So in terms of ascertaining the capital expenditures that are needed, this is definitely a phased process, and you get more refined as you go through due diligence and get bids and things of that sort. But what has been your ability, or do you have a method to approximating that relatively accurately up front, and how do you do that?
Yeah, it's
Loaded question, by the way.
yeah, it's not easy, especially with all the way that inflation has changed some certain costs lately. But it's not rocket science. At the end of the day, renovations of a certain caliber are pretty much the same cost. If you've got your generic, heavy unit turn where you're coming in with new flooring, new appliances, freshen up the cabinet fronts, new countertops, that typically costs in your market maybe somewhere between $4,000 to $7,500 or something like that. All right. So once you kind of have that guidance, you could just plug and play and use that as your baseline. And if you have a renovation that's more in scope, then obviously it can be more and accounted for. But yeah, I would say the interiors are pretty cookie cutter, right? You could just pick a number like 6,000 per unit or something like that. The exterior is kind of the big unknown until you get professional eyes on the deal. It's really tough. I mean, you need to check out the plumbing, you need to get on the roofs, you need to see what other major deferred maintenance there might be. So the way we approach that is we kind of just, depending on the story that we get from the owner and the broker and the age of the property, we kind of just throw a rough exterior number at it just so that we've got that catch-all. And then I would say more than 50% of the time, as we dig deeper and deeper, we go, you know what, actually it's in better shape than we thought. And then we end up trimming that exterior budget down.
It's better to do that than the opposite of saying, well, I don't know if anything needs to be replaced, so I just won't put anything. And then, oh, now you're in a retrade situation, right?
Yeah.
So very frustrating. Yeah, great advice there. So, okay, we really talked about underwriting the deal. We talked about income, expenses, CapEx, and those are really the main pieces that, like you said, all models are very similar in that regard. Let's talk about deal structure a little bit. So, there are a bunch of ways to structure a deal, with your investment base and capital stack. So, I guess my question to you is, what is Lone Star Capital's approach to doing this? Do you operate with multiple share classes, and that's on the equity side? Let's stop there. Let's talk on the equity side. How do you structure the private equity side, not the debt? We'll get to that in a second.
So our partnership structure with our investors, it of course can vary depending on the type of deal or the investors that we're working with. Sometimes we're working with larger funds or family offices and things like that, and things can be tailored more uniquely to what they're looking for. But the general structure always includes some level of fees, preferred return, and then a promote. So to break it down, I'll use our most typical structure, which will have a 2% acquisition fee at closing, a 2% asset management fee based on revenue that's paid out monthly, similar to the property management fee. And then the actual partnership side, we've got the preferred return. So most deals have a preferred return, but not all preferred returns are the same. So the way that our preferred return works is it's a cumulative and compounding minimum return that includes return of capital. So in effect, we're giving our investors a minimum of 8% IRR before the promote kicks in. And so we really like this because it is a really simple thing for an investor to wrap their head around, because we basically can say you're going to get a minimum of 8% cumulative and compounding on your money, and then all your money back, so your risk is off the table, and then we're going to split the profits, which is typically 70-30, 70% of the remaining profits to the investor and 30% to the sponsor. So, and there's good and bad reasons for a preferred return to be this way, which is this IRR-based hurdle. The bad thing for us is, as a sponsor, we don't make any performance compensation really until sale, because it's really hard to pay investors back all their money without a sale. And for an investor, that could also be a bad thing, because if your sponsor isn't being paid while holding, then they're more incentivized to sell. So if you're a long-term hold investor, it's a bit of a tricky situation because your structure is not really working for you. It may be working against you. So that is, tailored to every individual investor and the deal and whatnot. But that's how we generally have our structure set up.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And I think, when looking at different structures as an investor, the two things you have to ask yourself is, what's the motivation of the sponsor, right? And the second one is, how well capitalized does this make the sponsor look, right? And so there are a lot of sponsors doing deals like this, right, where you've been around for a while. I know Rob has been around for a while. You've made a little bit of money, and so maybe you don't have to, you're able to defer your profits till the end and really align the risk, align the risk towards the sponsor and away from the investor. And that really attracts a lot of people. It's like, okay, well, I'm going to get paid my money back and a small return before he gets anything. So he's incentivized to make this thing really kill it, right? So that's one way to question it. In your opinion, when you see deals that are structured to where a share of the cash flow along the way is going to the sponsor, and then there's a promote at the sale, does that turn you off at all, or does that send a different message to you?
Well, I would say, me as an investor, it would turn me off a bit. I mean, I am a limited partner in deals that do have a cash flow promote. So, it's not something that's so terrible, but as an investor, my preference would be the IRR-based hurdle, just because it offers more downside protection to the investor, as you mentioned, right? Because in a good year, there might be 10% cash flow, and then it gets a little bit promoted. But then in a bad year, 5% cash flow, right? There's really no penalty to the sponsor and whatnot. So it's, especially where cash flows are today, it's not like deals are spitting out 15% cash on cash returns.
That's
so
right.
This difference is minor, right? It's kind of more just structural and what is market for the place in which you're investing. So yeah, it doesn't turn me off a ton, but I think it's indicative of kind of the sponsor's mentality, as you mentioned.
Yeah. And I like the way you said it. When we were starting to do deals, years ago, we kind of started with a straight equity split. And I think it's because we didn't know any better. We weren't that smart back then, right? In terms of the financial side of it. And those worked fine. But, as soon as you start looking for deals where there is a preferred return on cash flow, I think that really incentivizes the sponsor to excel, even if they're getting a promote on top of it. Like you said, it's probably not very much. They're really not making a lot of money on cash flow. But if they have to get you to an 8% or a 7% or whatever before they even make a dime, that's going to incentivize performance as well. And then always, I'm a big fan of a preferred return and a hurdle at sale, right? So there needs to be some kind of, and if nothing else, maybe a biased equity table to where up until you get to, our structure, up until you get to a 10 IRR as an investor, you're getting, a large equity portion of the deal. Then after, between that and a 15, it would flip to a different equity split. And then after that, a different one, so it's like you really, until we make the deal sing, we're not getting any money. So it builds trust. So I love that y'all do that way as well. Any final thoughts, Rob? I know we could talk for days on this stuff, man. This is a lot of meat here, but any final thoughts you want to leave the audience with regarding how you guys do business with this.
Yeah, sure. So we covered the equity side, and I think we just scratched the surface because, as you hinted at before, there's structures out there that include the dual tranche, multiple classes with upside or no upside, and those are all interesting and handy ways tailored to the investor's goals. It's not something we have done yet, but it's just because we haven't felt the need to, not because we think it's a bad structure. But then just to kind of touch on the debt side.
Yes, I forgot to come back to that. Thank you, Rob.
Yeah. So to cover the debt side, the way that we feel about debt at the moment right now, we're seeing a couple things, right? We're seeing bridge debt is very attractive. And because cap rates are where they are, cash flow, debt service coverage constrained. So it's leaving people not being able to get max leverage on a permanent debt product. So a lot of people are searching for a bridge loan to get that extra leverage. And because bridge loans are cheap right now, it's really not much of a difference. So, from our perspective, it really is adding more risk to the market, more risk to deals, because if you're putting on a bridge loan on a deal that really doesn't have the lift of a bridge loan type scenario, it's a mismatch of term and risk and business plan. So we're staying away from those scenarios. I mean, we like bridge loans because they're a great way to execute a business plan where there's a real value add, but we're not going to force it if it's not really there. So we're looking at bridge loan deals on a case-by-case basis. And then on the permanent debt side, your options really are floating rate debt or fixed rate debt. And so we generally have a preference for floating rate debt because it gives us more flexibility. With a floating rate product, you can have a 1% prepayment penalty at any given time. So it means we can really be opportunistic with the way that we refinance or sell, which we really like. A lot of people might think we're crazy for taking floating rate debt today because they think interest rates are as low as they've ever been and as low as they ever will be. So you want to lock that in for as long as possible. And that may be true, but it's just really hard to give up that flexibility. So, but with that being said, if we are looking at some fixed rate opportunities, and on those, we're doing something that is maybe a bit more unique, which is preferring the 7-year loan term over the standard 10-year term, just because a 10-year loan is a really long time, and we would be more comfortable with the 7-year since we could probably exit around year 5 or year 6 and not really have a huge prepayment penalty at that point. So yeah, those are just kind of where we're at with the market right now.
Those are really some unique nuggets there. And I'm sorry, audience, I have to ask one more question now because he prompted me here. There's two schools of thought out there, or two of them that I think are important with fixed rate versus floating rate debt on these permanent debt products, right? One of them is, floating rate, like what you just described. Floating rate debt is flexible, right? I'm going to maybe pay a little more for it, but it is flexible, and the rate is subject to change. The other school of thought that I've heard, and actually I think it's kind of what we practice mostly, is the fixed rate debt side of things being very attractive today because of where the rates are. So what are your thoughts on floating versus fixed in the sense that, a floating or a fixed rate debt product could be originated today. Let's just use a 10-year note for example. The rates are let's say 3%, right? And we get a certain level of interest only. If you're doing big enough loans, you're out of the small balance loan category where they don't allow supplementals. There's the chance to use a supplemental as a refi. Now you may not get full leverage. You may get 70% or 75 maybe, but there's also the thought that these loans will be very, very desirable for the assumption market. And so there's some brokers thinking that 5 to 10 years down the road, we're going to see a whole lot of assumption transactions because, man, if rates really do go up and we're at 5%, man, that 3% assumption looks pretty good. Maybe I can put a second on it. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, do you have any opinions or?
Yeah, this is a great topic. I like this a lot. So a few things is, well, to directly answer to the idea about assumptions being attractive in the future. I mean, obviously, if you've got a in-place debt of 3% and the market rate is 5%, you have intrinsic value there on the loan. But the issue comes in with the amortization, right? If it's 5 years down the road and you've amortized down that loan for a couple years, right, cash flow is going to be not the best. And it depends on who you're selling to, which is determined largely by the product that you're selling. So if you're unless you're selling to an institutional buyer who can really overlook that lack of yield, you're going to be selling to a cash flow driven buyer, and they're going to really discount heavily the value of the property, even though the interest rate's great, but because the amortization is hurting the cash flows, they just can't get there. So I am seeing people who are saying what you're saying about, there's going to be value in the debt I'm locking in today, but what they're doing is they're getting full term interest only debt. And that is what will absolutely work, right? So if you get, 10-year loan with 10 years of interest only, you're not going to get 75% leverage today. You're going to get 60, 65. But if you want to sell in year 6 and on an assumption basis, right, someone will be glad to assume that loan because they're getting that interest only product. But, to make things more complicated on the agency side, when you assume a loan when there's less than 5 years of term, you really can't, it's very difficult to get in a supplemental. So it's further complicating the residual value component to the next buyer there. So I think those are kind of some of my thoughts there. It's a little more challenging than it sounds on paper. Then on the floating rate side, you're essentially, saying you're taking less of a macro bet. You're kind of saying, well, interest rates are going to be where they are, and I'm going to pay that price because I'm floating. And so it's not saying a macro bet is bad, right? Because it's probably true. Interest rates are probably the lowest they've ever been, and probably, maybe will ever be. I don't know. I don't know if they're necessarily going to rise a ton, but they're definitely low. So, the idea that you could lock today a spread between your cap rate and your fixed rate debt, and okay, now you've locked that spread for 10 years, that's a very powerful macro bet. On a floating rate side, you're not really getting that macro bet. You're basically just saying, all right, I think that I'm buying this piece of real estate. It's intrinsically valuable. And actually, your floating rate debt today will be cheaper than fixed rate, right? Today, floating rate's somewhere around 2.7%, and fixed rates are somewhere around 3.2 maybe. So there is a spread that you're getting today, but then obviously that's implying that rates will rise later. So, in either case, you're taking interest rate risk. It's just kind of in which direction are you taking it?
Absolutely. Rob, I love the conversation. This is a hot topic right now in a lot of people's minds. So thank you for your wisdom on that. All right. Well, if you don't mind, we're going to jump over to what we call the Quattro Trio, 3 questions we like to ask everyone who comes on the show. So Rob, what is your superpower? And I think we just heard it, right? But what is your superpower in this business?
All right. So I don't know how true this is, but the one that I've been going with as of late is my ability to take the complex and break it down and make it simple. I think that's a really valuable skill to have, especially in this business when you're talking to business partners, investors, and you're trying to, and brokers, and you're trying to be persuasive and you're trying to make things happen.
That's a pretty powerful one. And I think we just saw a lot of that exhibited in this call today. So thank you for that, Rob. And man, we've seen, clearly a lot of reasons why you're awesome, and Lone Star Capital is just amazing. But give me some dirt. What is your biggest failure to date, and what did it teach you?
I'm trying to remember if I actually wrote something down for this one, but prior to, because I can't remember my answer. So I'll have to think of something that is appropriate to share.
Well, I can share the answer from the questionnaire. It was about picking the wrong manager / partner, but didn't want to discuss in detail. So actually, Rob, if you don't like this, we can edit this part out if you don't want to go here on this one.
No, I'll touch on it. It's that's actually the thing that was on my mind, but wasn't quite feeling, ready to divulge. But yeah, basically, without getting too granular or too specific, I think everyone in the back of their mind knows this, but unfortunately, sometimes you have to live it and learn the lesson firsthand rather than just being told it. But it's so important who you're working with. It's so important to do due diligence on others, and relationships can be great and then bad the next day. So, one of the great things about real estate and the business that we're in is it's a very deal-driven business, and we can do a one-off deal, and that doesn't mean we're married. It doesn't mean we have to do every deal together for the rest of our lives, right? We can absolutely date. And so that's a great thing to start slow and do a deal here and there. Just try one and slowly build the relationship. And so, that way you're not making these huge bets and then potentially unwinding these big partnerships necessarily. So I think going, obviously when we're networking out there, we want to go and talk to as many people as possible and hand out our business card. So networking fast is great, but then actually partnering or making decisions, I think going slow is the best.
Fantastic. Couldn't agree more, Rob. And last thing, I know you have two things really for the audience. One is a free gift. What is that and where can they find it? And two, tell them about this book. Where can we find that?
Yeah, so the first thing is the free download of my underwriting model. It's the Lone Star model that we use day in, day out to underwrite over 500 deals a year. You can get that on our website, lscre.com. There's just a free download at the top. And if you want to accompany that free model and figure out how the heck to use it, you can check out my book, The Definitive Guide to Underwriting Multifamily Acquisitions. That's available in paperback and ebook on Amazon.
Fantastic, Robert. Thank you for that. And last question, should someone want to get in touch with you, invest, learn some things, or just say hello, what's the best way?
Yeah, you can email me. I'm active on LinkedIn as well. So if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, that's a great place. But also if you just want to email me directly, my email is rob@lonestarcapgroup.com.
All right. And as usual, all of this information will be in the show notes, including a link to the book and the underwriting model. So look for that. Scroll down wherever you get your podcasts. Rob, thank you for being on the show today. This was tremendous. A huge amount of value add for our listeners. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, Real Estate Runway listeners, this has been another episode of the Real Estate Runway podcast. For now, over and out.
We hope this episode was insightful and brought value to your day. If so, please be awesome and leave us a 5-star review. Find out how Team Quattro can help you at thequattroway.com. Until next time, this is the Real Estate Runway podcast.